be continuing our new series, Our Future on the Ballot. Over the next few months, we're going to be discussing critical issues with key emerging candidates from across the country. And today we're really excited to be speaking with Shemia Fagan about the race for the Oregon Secretary of State. Shemia, thank you so much for joining us here today. We're really, really excited to have you. And I wanted to begin by giving our viewers a little bit of context. So you've been described as representing the progressive wing of the Oregon Democratic Party. What do you think has shifted for progressives in Oregon over the events of the past year?
If I had to put it in a word, I would say urgency. There is an urgency to the issues facing us as a nation, as a state, from climate change to our housing crisis, income inequality, gun violence. There's an urgency and a sense of if the way we were doing things before was going to solve these problems, we wouldn't have them anymore. And so I think there is a focus on urgency on the issues that we're facing and maybe looking at a new approach to actually address that urgency, because for matters like climate change, for example, our state was just up in flames in the last couple of weeks with an unprecedented wildfire season. And so people's real lives are being affected by these very, very devastating challenges. And so urgency, I would say, is what has shifted.
So urgency in the context of the Secretary of State. I need you to explain this for us because some of our viewers might not know about it. And I admit I don't know much about specifically what the powers and role is of the Secretary of State in different states. And specifically in Oregon, what makes the Secretary of State in Oregon an important position? And why should people be paying attention to your race?
Well, your viewers are in good company, because when I announced my campaign for Secretary of State, I quickly learned that most people have no idea what the hell this job is, even in Oregon. And so that's a good place to start. One of my older brothers, who is a welder, when I told him I was running for Secretary of State, he said, Secretary of State, so you'll get people's coffee? So people are in good company if they don't know exactly what this job is. So I like to start there by just as an overview saying, the Secretary of State's role, in my view, is to make sure government's working for everybody, from running free, fair, and secure elections to auditing state revenues and programs to make sure they're making a real difference in the lives of people who need them the most, for conducting our public records in a way that makes our government open, transparent, and accountable, from running the Office of Small Business Assistance in our corporate division, the Office of Small Business Assistance that I helped create my first term in the Oregon House. Being Oregon's lieutenant governor, Oregon is one of the few states that don't have a lieutenant governor. Constitutionally, if our governor can't serve for any reason or chooses not to serve for any reason, then the Secretary of State automatically becomes governor. That's actually how our current governor, Kate Brown, became governor in 2015. She was Secretary of State when our governor resigned. And then, of course, this year, more important than ever, it is very possible that Oregon's Secretary of State will have a direct role in redistricting with reapportionment. Just quickly, the Oregon Constitution gives the legislature that task, but they have a hard July 1 deadline. If they don't finish it in time, it goes to the Secretary of State. And this year, with the census delays because of COVID or the potential litigation over whether or not the Trump administration not allowing those deadlines to be extended, it's certainly possible that redistricting data won't even be to the states until after that July 1 deadline. And I'm proud to be endorsed by the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, which is the Obama holder group, because I promised if I am in charge of redistricting, to do it in a way that's independent, nonpartisan, but also is centered in historically underrepresented and marginalized communities, which I think is what's missing in a lot of independent commissions across the country.
Fantastic. Thank you for that overview. Okay, so elections. As you mentioned, one of the duties of the Oregon Secretary of State is overseeing elections and making sure that they happen fairly, something we're having a lot of discussion about in this country right now. This past week, Donald Trump had talked about getting rid of the ballots. That's the quote, calling the legitimacy of mail-in ballots into question and refusing to commit to a peaceful transfer of power post-election. So why are we seeing, in your opinion, attempts to reject the legitimacy of the democratic process? And how do you personally plan to protect the legitimacy of popular democracy if you are elected?
Well, first off, I just want to say unequivocally that claims of widespread voter fraud are a myth. And they're a myth perpetrated by folks who want to make it harder for certain people to vote. They want to pick their voters by making claims of widespread voter fraud. We've been voting by mail in Oregon for over 20 years. We were the first state to do it. I'm young enough to where I've never voted any other way. Vote by mail started in 1998 in statewide elections in Oregon. And my first vote that I was eligible for was the 2000 election. I've never voted any other way. It is incredibly safe and secure. We have paper trails, so we don't allow any of our the internet to access any of our counting machines. We have forensic signature verification. We have unique barcode ballot tracking. So Oregon's elections are incredibly secure. So number one, Emily, it's pushing back on the bullshit, which is what we're hearing, right? We're hearing this misinformation that has been debunked. I'll tell you, I don't quote conservative think tanks very often, but when I do, it's to combat claims of voter fraud. And the Conservative Heritage Foundation actually analyzed Oregon's vote by mail system. They looked at 15.5 million ballots cast since 1998. And do you know how many instances of voter fraud they found? 14. That is 0.0000001. And to put that in context for your viewers, there's a lot of things we do in our everyday lives that vote by mail is safer than. Drinking coffee, for example. The FDA allows up to 5% of coffee beans to have mold in them. But, you know, folks enjoy their safe morning coffee. Vote by mail is even safer. Chocolate. The FDA allows up to 1% of cocoa beans to have insect bug parts. And yet it's safe and folks enjoy their chocolate. And vote by mail is even safer than chocolate. Vote by mail is safer than safe sex because the best protection out there is 99.7% effective. Vote by mail is safer than that. So we here in Oregon think folks should keep drinking coffee, keep enjoying chocolate, keep having consensual safe sex, and keep voting by mail. And we will continue to combat the misinformation coming out of the White House or coming out of anywhere, because we in Oregon, and this includes Oregon Republicans, know that vote by mail is safe, secure, and accessible, and it's not going anywhere.
I'm going to admit, I have never thought of comparing the safety of voting to the safety of chocolate, coffee, or sex. So I am grateful to have those new numbers that you've presented and the math that you were able to do for us just now. Okay, so speaking of the accessibility of ballots, even before the pandemic, you were a proponent of making ballots more accessible, sponsoring 2019 legislation to make the state actually pay for mail-in ballot postage. And you also brought a proposal to lower the voting age. So your Republican opponent, Kim Thatcher, voted against that legislation, along with most other Republican legislators. How has the issue of mail-in ballots and accessibility somehow become partisan?
Well, it never was in Oregon before. I'll be honest with you, Emily, vote by mail is about the most boring topic in Oregon politics. It has worked so well for so long for everybody that up until Donald Trump became president, it was not something that we talked about, because it's like asking a fish, how's the water? And the fish says, what's water? Because you don't even notice it, because it works so well under Republican secretaries of state and Democratic secretaries of state for over 20 years, until Donald Trump came along, of course, and has decided to make it a partisan issue. But let's be clear, access to the ballot, making sure government works for everybody, these shouldn't be partisan issues. And supporting those things is not because I'm a Democrat, it's because I believe in democracy. And so it's sad to see folks opposing those things. Automatic voter registration is a great example, Emily, of something that we passed here in Oregon back in 2015, first in the nation, to instead of making people opt in to register to vote, we just took all the folks that we knew were eligible through our DMV records and gave them a chance to opt out if they don't want to be registered, but we otherwise automatically register them. That, which is simple and definitely impacts and helps folks in rural counties, more Republican counties, actually be registered in greater numbers. That was a party line vote here in Oregon, but it hasn't been elsewhere. So I do have hope that if we continue to put good government, good democracy ideas out there, that after we say goodbye to Donald Trump, the Republican Party will come back around to seeing those as the nonpartisan, good government, pro-democracy policies that they are.
So that's a lot of faith in the Republican Party to come back around. And speaking of who has a voice and how they get a voice, let's talk about redistricting. So redistricting of Oregon's congressional districts, as you mentioned, is set to take place following the current census, whenever that is able to wrap up. So Initiative Petition 57 was a ballot initiative in Oregon to take the power to conduct this redistricting out of the hands of the legislature and put it into the hands of a 12-member commission. Due to a decision of the current Secretary of State, however, Initiative Petition 57 will not be appearing on the November ballot, as the organizers were unable to get the required signatures during the pandemic. So tell us, is there anything you can and would do if elected to ensure that the redistricting process happens fairly? What would you do differently?
Well, that's incredibly important. Folks need to believe that the foundation of our democracy, that one person, one vote representation, is done in a fair way. And I want to make sure, first off, that it's not actually a decision by the Secretary of State. It's the Constitution of Oregon requires a certain exact number of signatures in order to amend the Oregon Constitution, which is what this initiative would have done. And so just to be clear, it was actually the Oregon Constitution. They just didn't collect the enough signatures, and there wasn't really an end run around that. But what I have committed to doing is to doing it in a nonpartisan, independent commission fashion. But the key that I want to add in that we've seen fail in states like California that have an independent commission, but then because of the way they have structured it and done it, it's ended up being folks who are overwhelmingly upper middle class, overwhelmingly white, and more male than actually California is as a whole, who've been doing the redistricting. I think it's important to avoid that, to make sure that whatever independent commission we have, we work with community-based organizations that serve historically underrepresented folks. Because of course, redistricting is a place in which our country's history is fraught, right? When we started as a country, we didn't even count all people as people in our counting. And so I think it's important that we recognize that history and that injustice and make sure that we don't make a new independent redistricting that perpetuates that inequity. And so what I've committed to doing, and that's why I have the support of the Obama Holder Group, is to actually do it in a way that's independent and nonpartisan, but also making sure that we have hard racial equity goals and not only what the districts look like, but actually on that commission itself. And I think one key, Emily, is we got to pay folks, right? You can't have people do tedious, time-consuming government work for free, because if you do, there's only a certain amount of folks that can afford the time, the free time to do that. So we need to pay people fairly in a stipend to do this work. We also need to make sure that when we have these meetings, we have childcare on site. We have, evening and weekend meetings so that folks who maybe work traditional 9-to-5 jobs can still go and participate. So there's a lot of things we can do to make it more fair, but I do think that it's important that we have it be an independent, nonpartisan commission.
Thank you for giving us really concrete. I appreciate the executable nature of the ideas that you've mentioned, and thank you for that. So let's turn to you. We've been talking about ideas and policy for this entire time, but I would like to ask you who you are since we've just met. So you grew up, as I understand it, in a working class neighborhood in East Portland. And maybe you could share with our viewers a little bit about your background and how your experience growing up in a low-income neighborhood shaped your approach to politics.
Well, when you say who I would say I'm sometimes the last person that folks would expect to be running for the second highest office in Oregon. I actually grew up in small towns in rural Oregon. And I know that you have a large audience, and maybe a lot of those folks don't have a place to think of when they think of rural Oregon. But I'll tell you, the little town I grew up in had a population of 537 people. Not 537,000, 537 people, a little town called Dufur, Oregon. But you're right, my mom actually spent most of her time in eastern East Portland, which is actually part of the city of Portland, but it's a more low-income part of Portland known as East Portland. And my mom battled meth and opioid addiction and homelessness for most of my life. So my dad actually raised me in rural Oregon, and he was a single parent. And I have two older brothers and my dad. So I was the only girl, and my dad struggled to make ends meet. In fact, the summer before I started second grade, I remember going on this really long camping trip, and I remember catching crawdads and roasting marshmallows and sleeping in a big family tent. And I didn't learn until many years later from my older brothers that what had really happened, which is when we been evicted from our house, we had nowhere else to go, that we were homeless. But my dad took us camping to try and hide the homelessness while he tried to find a place for us to live. And that's when we moved to that little town of Dufur in a little trailer there. And about a decade later, I went to visit my mom in East Portland. At this point, my brother and I, who was driving me, we hadn't seen her in probably 3 or so years. She'd been battling unsheltered homelessness, and she invited us to come see her. And my brother pulled up to a huge house, like a Victorian house with a huge wraparound porch. And mom greeted us and then walked us around to the front steps. But instead of walking up the steps, she dropped to her hands and knees and she crawled under the porch. And then she invited us into her home. And my brother and I, dropped to all fours and crawled into the porch behind her. And we spent the day on a sleeping bag she had unzipped to cover the dirt underneath us. And so it's those experiences that have really fueled me both as a lawmaker in Oregon in the House and the Senate, and as a civil rights attorney to fight for people who are hanging on by a thread, because I know what that feels like. But I've also seen, what government services that work can do for folks, like the public schools in Oregon that literally changed the course of my life and gave me the opportunity to go be an attorney, to be in the Oregon House and the Oregon Senate, and to now be running for Oregon Secretary of State.
So in that run, you won a very tight primary, and a big part of your support came from labor unions. The COVID-19 crisis and wildfires obviously have been devastating for the workers who make up many of those unions, particularly teachers, services workers, firefighters. And you've got this background as a civil rights lawyer. You've got a background, as I understand it, also in employment law. How has that shaped your perception of what the state should be doing to protect workers during this crisis?
Well, thanks for acknowledging the heroes that are on the front lines of our COVID crisis. And as you mentioned, our wildfires here in Oregon. And I get pushback sometimes because of how enthusiastically the working people across this state support me. But I don't, when I get endorsed by a union, I don't see a union. I see hundreds of thousands of working people who I think support me for a really simple reason. And that's throughout my career, I have expressed values that everyone who works should be paid a living wage, should have health insurance, should have secure retirement, should get time off when they or a family member are sick or when they welcome a new child into their home. And they should have a say in the workplace safety. And for those basic reasons, working people all across Oregon have supported me both in the private sector and the public sector, but not just folks that are in labor unions. I've received the support of hundreds of thousands of working people in Oregon that aren't even in labor unions, because one thing I've been proud to do in the legislature in conjunction with many labor unions in Oregon is they work to pass legislation that helps everybody. Even a gas station worker in a rural community in Oregon, they're not just that they want to have paid sick leave for them too. We want to have raising the minimum wage for them too. We want to make sure that they can take time off when they're sick or a family member is welcomed into their family. And so I've been proud to be supporting policies for working people. I know what it's like to grow up in a family without those protections. And I know how important it is for folks to have those protections just to enjoy the stability of an ordinary life. And I've always fought for that. And for that reason, I'm happy and proud to have been supported by the working people in our state.
So Shemia, I'm really happy to have had an opportunity to sort of unpack how your background, both professionally and personally, informs who you are in this role that you seek. And now I want to turn to something extremely controversial. And I want to ask you a question that could really light the room on fire. Okay. I understand you to be a karaoke lover. What is your go-to song when you want to just bring the house down?
Well, of course, as a karaoke lover, I don't have one go-to song. Of course, I have a go-to from the past, which is, of course, I Want It That Way by the Backstreet Boys. But I usually need a good friend of mine, and I always do that together. But then there's something current always that gets to me. And currently it is Lizzo's Good as Hell. And so I would say Backstreet Boys, I Want It That Way for a throwback. But then, of course, as a karaoke lover, I, of course, do more than one song. And I do follow the very, very, I think, strict karaoke code, which is the worse singer you are, the better you are at karaoke. And I will therefore brag and say I am wonderful at karaoke.
My only regret from this show is not giving you an opportunity to prove it, because we are at our time. But Shemia Fagan, it has been such a pleasure getting to know you here on The Briefing. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you again for this continuing series and more of our regular coverage coming up.